Yeah, it's difficult to sort of come up with an overarching question. They're very different kinds of contexts. So I'll make a couple of comments, and then perhaps we can try to sort of couch them within the context of the broader themes. One of the things that I was interested in is you chose two very different communities, right? In two very different kinds of spaces. They had very different trajectories from a migration point of view. People who sort of took the initiative forcibly. I mean, obviously Kurds don't have an easy time with it, and they had a very difficult journey getting to where they got to in Britain. But they seem, the way you presented them is that they're quite, they're quite empowered, and they're quite, they consider themselves world citizens. And the Karen, I used to work with Laotian refugees who came also from the Thai border, so well, that sounds kind of familiar. And there are actually some Karen in Kitchener, Waterloo, where I worked, but they had a very, very different kind of trajectory, because they basically went where they were allowed to go, and they spent, I don't know how many years your population that you worked with actually spent in refugee camps, waiting to come to the country, not necessarily their own choice. So what I was kind of interested in terms of both of the presentations around issues of agency from an identity point of view, because I'd like to make an observation in relation to those the Kurds in Britain and the Turks. I think that there's a certain kind of aspirational sensibility. They have created, obviously, a community with ethnic associations, with the kinds of, resources that make them feel comfortable and so on. To call yourself a world citizen is great, because there's really very little chance that you will really call yourself and be accepted as a British citizen. So, I mean, we find this often with people who are, we consider the other, so to speak. For example, there's a book in anthropology recently you may be interested in, which talks about South Asian migrants in Dubai, who've been living there for 20, 30, 40 years, very wealthy, but they know very well that there isn't a chance that they're ever going to become citizens in Dubai. Absolutely not, yeah. Absolutely not. But nonetheless, they have developed this sort of alternative sensibility about their relationship to where they are, to where they always have been, and to where they intend to stay, regardless of what the government of Dubai tells them. No, we just need you for, and they're really quite well established. So I think there's an aspirational sense around that. I'm not so sure that they prefer to be thought of as world citizens as opposed to British citizens. So I think that's something to think about. I'm also interested why you chose these two very, very different groups. I mean,
because when our topic was about transnationalism, I was thinking about the groups I have worked with so far, and I was thinking about their transnational activities. And I'm like, when you think about refugees, to what extent they are transnational? And I'm like, to what extent they can be transnational? Because my more current research was with Karen refugees, right? And when I looked at them, the lives, their new lives here in London, Ontario, I said, it's not possible for them. How can they be transnational? And I was thinking, if they had these transnational links, if they had those resources, maybe their sense of identities in the new country and their aspirations in the new society would be different. But their only choice is actually to stay and to adapt to what is given to them. But in the British case, and then I was thinking about if it's the same for all refugees, then this brought me back to my previous research. I'm like, no, it wasn't the same for the Kurdish in Britain, because they were living in their own communities, and they had all these transnational resources. They could still keep their ties with back home. Everything was available to them. They could still keep their lives as it was, how it was back in Turkey. But I just wanted to show how these transnational ties can be different for different groups, because always we tend to talk about in the new global age, the migrants have these transnational links, and it makes things different now. It's easier when you compare with before. It's easier for immigrants to have a new life because of these global and transnational ties. I'm like, really? I don't think it's the case for everybody. It depends on where you're coming from. It depends on in which country you are resettled, you are living, and it depends what resources you have. So I wanted to actually to show that, it's not there, it's not given. We may be living in a global, transnational era with lots of technologies which links us to everybody all around the world, but we shouldn't assume that it's a given for everybody. Some groups still do not use these resources, and it's a different adaptation process, and I think it also has important effects on their sense of identities. Because if you can still maintain these links with back home, you can still maintain your own identity. You don't have to, change it. You basically live the same life here, right? But if you don't have any attachment, any links to back home, then I don't know what I would do.
From being refugees for a long time in this case.
Yeah.
Also, just a quick question, I know you want to open it up. It's really interesting in the Spanish context because it seems like people are sort of really, from what I got in terms of the presentation, that they're quite agentive. They're quite, they want to establish these sensibilities about themselves as Spaniards or as Catalan or whatever. But it's really interesting, as you said, on the part of the Spanish government because it has such a long history as, in terms of the influence of Islam in a really interesting and celebratory kind of way in the context of the ways in which Spanish history has been written. It seems to me that couching it also more in the context of the EU and the dynamics around, I hate the term Islamophobia, but just all the sensibilities around and the kinds of worries that they have around their shores being flooded and so on by people coming from Morocco and all the and everywhere else. But that really has an impact on the ways in which they're, identifying preferred groups to the complete exclusion of others that are obviously Islamic?
I think certainly the EU, kind of like the French uneasiness, to call it in that way, with Muslims and their horrible history of colonialism. They do seep into the Spanish mentality, but even if Spain was not within the EU, they will have their own kind of like long history of colonialism and interactions with the stereotypes of the Moor, which popularly are still called that way, is an stereotype that fed of the 19th century colonial wars. It fed of Franco was a general that made himself in North Africa, in the Spanish territories there. So there is such a wealth of stereotypes that anti-Islamic stereotypes that Spanish can draw on, and that they keep being reproduced in the media and in the popular culture. That I think the EU just reinforces things, but does not necessarily trigger it. It's internally, the narratives are internal.
Okay, thanks. There are, I'm sure, a number of burning issues, so I do want to give a bit of time. And I'm interested also in picking up on your presentation, Daphne, and the ideas, which I think I heard in all three presentations of nationalism and economic prosperity somehow tied in with citizenship and the regulation of citizenship. And of course we see examples of that in Canada too. So I will open it up to the floor. I invite people, I'll take maybe 2 questions if there are, and we'll give people opportunity, the panelists an opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Daphne. That was a very enlightening presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I know we are time limited. So I'm just going to ask quickly, what is the alternative to transnationalism?
Okay, so hold that question, and I'll take one more, and then we'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond.
Thank you all for that. I have a sort of a wider question for everyone, and that's a point that was made in the last presentation, and differentiating between the narrative, the discourse of citizenship and rights versus the practice of it. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, how does that, and by practice, more specifically, the performances of those citizenships or identities or hybrid identities, if that emerges, especially in the case of Canada Canada, or the Canadian versus the Turkish, not Turkish British identities, or the Croatian identities, or the Muslim Spanish identities. What those practices are, and who are these practices, these performances constructed by? Are they simply reproducing something that's been created for them, reproducing a narrative, or are they in fact creating their own hybrid or non-hybridized identities? Which sort of links to sort of just a side question to the presentation on the very first presentation, which was, have you thought about, in terms of transnational, not particularly expanding the notion of transnational to transnational spaces and incorporating what Abderrahmane has called the mindscapes of imagination, and what role that plays in creating these identities? So not just simply linking to the tangible resources or the tangible personal relationships and connections, but to the imagination of those connections and those ties, and how that plays into that.
So, yeah. So, I'll turn it over to the three of you to answer. Do you want to start, Sati, with the first question?
Yeah, the first question was alternative to transnationalism, right? So what's the alternative? Transnationalism refers to being in different places at the same time, right? You know, you can be linked, and it's not physically, you know, it's about being linked to different nations, to different lands or spaces at the same time. You know, you might be here, but you may have your links and attachments to different land in another part of the world, and you have your links and relationships with people at different parts of the world. And actually, the opposite of transnationalism would be localism, which would be, you know, just a territorialism, being attached to the land that you are living in and not extending it. But actually, in the field of transnationalism, now people are discussing if it is possible today, because even by only using the internet, people are also networking with people from different parts of the world today. You know, we hear about political events, you hear what happened, what demonstrations, protests are happening in which country momentarily. And now people are discussing if you are using these technologies, how can you be non-transnational? So I think you would be, you know, the alternative would be for the people who are not using these technologies and who are just staying in their local spaces by not networking with people from other spaces. And, you know, also I think imagination is also important. You know, maybe it can be a link, even imaginary or relationship. If you relate yourself to a land somewhere over there, even if, you know, you are not living there, maybe you have never seen that. Like current people, they have never seen their villages, but they are still somehow attached to that land that they have never seen in their life. So when you think about it, if you define transnationalism like being attached to different places at the same time, it will depend how you're defining it. I think if you define this way, it seems like it is not possible if you're an immigrant, because even if not physically, you will be emotionally and imaginarily attached to another land. But if you are thinking about physical transnationalism, it is possible. And the opposite to me is the localism.
I just wanted to say something about transnationalism, because I mean, I teach about this kind of stuff too, and as we all do, I guess. And to me, I don't like getting stuck on these kinds of terms around, you know, even localism, because it's a heuristic tool, you know, diasporas as well. I never would have used that term had I not been told to by the people that I worked with. This is what means to us, has meaning for us, so you must use it because this is how we want to describe and discuss our anxieties and the ways in which we deal with the day-to-day, right? And I was averse to it, but nonetheless it had meaning for them. So, and it continues to in some weird and wacky ways, which is what I find really interesting. So I'm not so sure about the application of these kinds of terminologies and these kinds of these terms, because what they do is they really tend to emplace the kinds of things that are really difficult to pin down in the ways that we'd like to in order to make sense of them. So yeah, I don't know if there's an alternative to transnational if it doesn't work.
I think that was my problem from the beginning,
Yeah.
because I look at the term, and if you look at it exhaustively, you have a lot of problems with it. Because in the case of the people in London, of the Turkish people, how did they get there? Who brought them there? Was it out of their own personal agencies, or what did the United Nations bring them out of?
No, for the Turkish case, it was in United. They were asylum seekers, and actually, everybody I talked, they went with human traffickers. You know, they just wanted to get out. They needed to get out of the country quickly.
So
they
they
contacted some human traffickers, and they didn't choose where they are going. You know, they just found these people, made the payment, and these people put them in the trucks, and okay, we are going. You know, they didn't know where they were even heading.
So they had an established social network before they got there, right?
Yes.
Okay, in the case of the Cambodians,
The Karen refugees,
Yes.
no, they don't have the established network.
So
It was the UN who brought them
exactly.
here.
So right from the beginning, there's always an imbalance of power, economic power, social power,
Yes.
and the interconnected. There's already a disparity there. So when you have two different groups starting a new form of existence on different thresholds, then it's difficult to talk about transnationalism, in the same set for the two of them. Because on the one hand, why these people are already have this strong network of how to get about, these people have nothing. So I think it becomes problematic to begin to use that term, to try to bring an understanding for the two groups. We don't have a lot of
No,
time,
but
so-
actually, I was talking about the transnational activities. They were, their transnational activities in the host societies, and transnational activities are, in the literature, these are the activities that brings people to their home countries. Okay, and I was, giving examples to show you how they were linked to the other people from their own ethnicity back at home or in different European countries. These are visiting Turkey, visiting other people in different countries, sending money, remittances. These are all considered as transnational activities. Or being able to buy the newspaper, for example, your own. Being able to consume anything you will be able to consume back at home. If you are able to do that, these are also considered as a part of transnationalism.
Tanya, do you want to add anything in response to the questions?
Well, I don't know what the alternative to transnationalism is, but I can see that if we connect this idea of transnationalism with the transnational landscape and the geographies, I am very interested in nativism. I'm very interested in kind of like this form of extreme nationalism that can only see itself, and how Muslims are interacting with it. And transnationalism in this context becomes a threat. Yeah, and if not a threat, an irrelevancy. Transnationalism is something not to be celebrated or embraced. It's something to be denied, and if not possible, ignored. Because the cultural landscape is still very national. And when I say national, I mean local, particular. And against that, it's very hard to break in. And one last point about, we haven't addressed the idea of the discourse and the practice. Once you assume that a group is stable enough to have citizenship and at least formally are entitled to presence and to rights, the question becomes, how do they make those rights happen? Whether they have the possibility to behave as citizens. And in this sense, Muslim immigrants in Spain have modified their fight from legal rights to religious rights because they are denied the public practice of Islam in mosque building, in being able to pray, have accommodations at work, in being able to follow Ramadan. In symbolically, they have the legal right to practice Islam with an agreement with the state, but the practice of it is completely constrained. especially their visibility is not welcome. Their mosques are pushed to industrial areas outside of town so that the interaction is minimized. So in that sense, the practice of citizenship is the next struggle. It's not so much status, it's not so much citizenship, but it's the idea of belonging. Who belongs? When if you're a practicing Muslim, belonging means that you can go to a mosque, that you can have Islamic institutions, and that they are not under threat. They are embraced and welcomed. Canada, I mean, the hockey game was the CBC was showing images of mosques, people in mosques watching the hockey game. It was like that symbolic, like little symbolic element that we are all in this together. That would never, ever happen in Spain. Never. Yeah. Or in Croatia. So in that sense, I think nativism can also help explain why Kurdish are so primordial, because they cannot be British, so they might as well keep being Kurdish. While Karen, in Canada, they can be Karen Canadian. They are even encouraged with those kind of like nice image of the three classes,
But
right?
even that's problematic, right?
Well, oh yeah,
What that
certainly.